The woman's grip on his arm was entirely out of place for the opulent lobby of the Waldorf Astoria. Her diamond necklace was skewed, her breathing shallow and ragged. "Pretend you're my husband," she begged, her voice trembling. Lucas looked down, expecting a prank, but what he saw froze the blood in his veins. It wasn't just panic in her sharp, hazel eyes. It was raw, unadulterated terror. Two men in dark suits were scanning the crowd, and they were looking for her. Lucas Miller adjusted the collar of his stiff, heavily starched shirt, staring at his reflection in the gilded mirrors of the Waldorf Astoria lobby. He despised wearing suits. He was a man accustomed to the scent of sawdust, rich earth, and drafting paper. As an independent landscape architect, he made his living shaping the outdoors, not suffocating in a wool blend that cost him a week's groceries. But today was different. Today, he was pitching a comprehensive redesign for the sprawling grounds of the new Kensington estate, a contract that would single-handedly pay for his 7-year-old daughter Lily's upcoming cochlear implant surgery. He checked his battered leather watch. 7:14 p.m. His prospective clients were late. Lucas sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He thought of Lily, currently being babysat by his neighbor, Mrs. Higgins. It had been 4 years since his wife, Sarah, had passed away from an aggressive lymphoma, leaving Lucas to navigate the terrifying waters of single parenthood alone. He had done his best, but the mounting medical bills for Lily's degenerative hearing loss were a relentless tide. He needed this job. He was just turning toward the hotel bar to order a sparkling water when a force slammed into his side. Lucas stumbled, instinctively reaching out to catch the person before they both hit the marble floor. His hands gripped silk and frail shoulders. He looked down to see a woman in a stunning, midnight blue evening gown. Her hair, a cascade of dark chestnut waves, was disheveled. Mascara smudged the corners of her eyes, and one of her diamond earrings was missing, leaving an angry red scratch on her earlobe. "Whoa, easy there," Lucas said, his deep voice steadying. "Are you all right, miss?" She didn't step back. Instead, she closed the distance, pressing herself against his chest. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his cheap suit jacket with a desperate, white-knuckled grip. "Pretend you're my husband," the woman begged, the words tumbling from her lips in a breathless, frantic whisper. Lucas blinked, utterly bewildered. "Excuse me?" "Please," she pleaded, her hazel eyes locking onto his. The sheer intensity of the fear in her gaze hit Lucas like a physical blow. "Please, just for 5 minutes. If they find me alone, I'm dead. Put your arm around me. Smile. Please." Lucas's survival instincts, honed from years of protecting his daughter, flared to life. He looked over the woman's head, near the revolving glass doors of the lobby. 2 massive men in tailored black suits had just entered. They weren't hotel security. They moved with the predatory, synchronized grace of professional fixers. Their eyes scanned the affluent crowd, dismissive of the wealth, searching for a specific target. They were looking for the woman, trembling against his chest. Lucas didn't know her. He didn't know if she was a thief, a runaway bride, or a corporate spy. But the terror radiating from her was palpable. She felt like a bird trapped in a snare, waiting for the hunter's boot to drop. Without another word, Lucas slipped his large, calloused hand around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. With his free hand, he reached up and gently tucked a loose strand of her chestnut hair behind her ear, leaning down so his lips hovered just inches from her forehead. "Laugh at something I'm saying," Lucas murmured, painting a warm, affectionate smile on his face. "Make it look real." Now, the woman let out a breathy, forced giggle, resting her head against his shoulder. "Thank you," she breathed. "Don't thank me yet," Lucas said, his eyes tracking the two men through the reflection of the mirrored pillar beside them. "They're walking this way." "Oh, God!" she choked out, her grip on him tightening. "Hey, look at me," Lucas commanded softly, turning her face upward. He traced her jawline, feigning an intimate conversation. "My name is Lucas. What's yours?" "Catherine," she whispered. "Okay, Catherine. We're going to walk slowly toward the elevators. If they intercept us, you let me do the talking. You've had a bit too much champagne, and I'm taking my beautiful wife up to our room." "Understood." She nodded infinitesimally. Lucas turned them smoothly, keeping his body positioned between Catherine and the approaching men. He adopted a relaxed, confident stride, the gait of a man who belonged in a five-star hotel with a stunning woman on his arm. They navigated through the throngs of wealthy socialites, moving closer to the bank of elevators. "Excuse me, sir," a gruff voice called out from behind them. Lucas felt Catherine go completely rigid. He squeezed her waist reassuringly and turned around, pasting a look of mild, polite annoyance on his face. The taller of the two men, a brute with a broken nose and cold, dead eyes, stepped into their personal space. He ignored Lucas entirely, staring directly at Catherine. "Ms. Whitmore. Mr. Caldwell has a car waiting outside for you. He insists you join him for dinner." "Whitmore." The name echoed in Lucas's mind. Catherine Whitmore, the billionaire CEO of Whitmore Holdings. She was practically royalty in this city, a titan of real estate and tech. Catherine opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Lucas stepped forward, shielding her slightly. "I think you have the wrong idea, pal," he said, his voice dropping an octave into a protective, authoritative growl. "My wife isn't going anywhere with a Mr. Caldwell. We're celebrating our anniversary, and the only place she's going is upstairs with me." The enforcer narrowed his eyes, sizing Lucas up. Lucas was 6'2", with the broad shoulders and thick muscles of a man who spent his days hauling timber and stone. He didn't flinch. "This doesn't concern you," the man sneered, reaching a hand out toward Catherine. Before the man's fingers could graze her, Lucas slapped his hand away with a resounding crack that drew the attention of nearby guests. "Touch her, and I'll break your arm," Lucas said evenly, his tone completely devoid of bluff. "Now, back off, before I have hotel security drag you out by your cheap lapels." The commotion caused a nearby concierge to step forward, accompanied by two uniformed hotel guards. "Is there a problem here, sir?" the concierge asked Lucas. "No problem," Lucas said smoothly. "These gentlemen were just leaving. They mistook my wife for someone else." The enforcer glared at Lucas, memorizing his face. "Caldwell isn't going to like this. Ms. Whitmore," he muttered under his breath. He gave a sharp nod to his partner, and the two men turned on their heels, disappearing back into the crowded lobby. Lucas didn't exhale until the elevator doors dinged open. He ushered Catherine inside, hitting the button for the underground parking garage. As the doors slid shut, cutting them off from the lobby, Catherine collapsed against the polished wood paneling of the elevator, burying her face in her hands. "You're safe," Lucas said quietly, giving her space. She looked up at him, her chest heaving. "You don't understand. I'm not safe. I'm never going to be safe." They sat in the cab of Lucas's beat-up 2014 Ford F-150. The contrast between the billionaire CEO and the dusty interior, littered with blueprints and an empty juice box, was almost comical. But there was no humor in the air. Rain had begun to fall, drumming a steady, isolating rhythm against the roof of the truck. Lucas had missed his pitch. The Kensington estate job was gone. But as he looked at the shivering woman in the passenger seat, wearing his heavy flannel work jacket over her ruined designer gown, he knew he couldn't have left her. "Roland Caldwell," Catherine said, her voice hollow as she stared out the rain-streaked window. "He was my father's protégé. When my father passed away suddenly last year, he left me the controlling shares of Whitmore Holdings in a trust." "I'm sorry for your loss," Lucas said, handing her a thermos of lukewarm black coffee. She took it with trembling hands. "Don't be. My father was a brilliant businessman, but a paranoid, controlling patriarch. He didn't believe a woman could run the empire alone. So, he put a morality clause in the trust. I don't inherit the controlling voting rights until I turn 35. She paused, taking a slow sip. "Unless I am married to a stable, respectable partner before that date," Lucas frowned. "And if you're not, then the voting rights default to the board of directors, which is currently in Roland Caldwell's pocket. Once Roland has control, he'll absorb Whitmore Holdings into his hedge fund, liquidate our assets, and fire 50,000 employees." She turned to look at Lucas. "My 35th birthday is this Friday, 48 hours from now." Lucas let out a low whistle. "So, those guys back there, Roland's men," she confirmed. "He's been trying to force me into a marriage with him for 6 months. When I refused, he started threatening me. Then the threats escalated to stalking. Tonight, he tried to have me physically abducted from the gala upstairs. If he can keep me hidden until midnight on Friday, he wins. If he forces me to a magistrate and I sign under duress, he wins." She set the thermos on the dashboard and turned fully toward Lucas, her hazel eyes hardening with a desperate resolve. The terrified woman from the lobby was fading. The CEO was stepping forward. "You protected me in there," Catherine said. "You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. And you stood up to 2 armed men. You didn't even blink." "I don't like bullies," Lucas said simply. "And I've got a daughter. I'd like to think if she were ever in trouble, some stranger would step up for her." At the mention of his daughter, Catherine's gaze flickered to the empty juice box in the cup holder. A calculating light entered her eyes. "What's your name?" she asked. "Lucas Miller." "What do you do for a living, Mr. Miller?" "Landscape architect, contractor. I build things." Catherine took a deep breath. "Mr. Miller, I am going to make you an offer. I know it sounds like absolute madness, but I am entirely out of options. And you are the first man I've met in a year who hasn't looked at me like a walking bank account." She squared her shoulders. "I need a husband. Now, tonight. Legally bound and registered on paper before Friday." Lucas stared at her, the rain pattering heavily against the windshield. "You've got to be kidding me." "I have never been more serious in my life," Catherine said. "We get a marriage license. We sign a prenuptial agreement. We stay married for exactly 1 year to satisfy the board's scrutiny. You attend public events with me, play the part of a loving husband, and keep Roland Caldwell away from me. At the end of the 12 months, we divorce amicably due to irreconcilable differences." Lucas shook his head, reaching for the keys in the ignition. "Look, lady, I feel for you. I really do. But I'm just a guy, trying to raise a kid. I can't get involved in some billionaire corporate warfare." $2 million, Catherine said, her voice cutting through the damp air. Lucas froze, his hand hovering over the keys. $2 million. deposited into a secure offshore account the moment the ink dries on our marriage certificate. Catherine continued, leaning closer. Whatever debt you have, whatever you need to provide for your daughter, it's done. You'll never have to worry about a mortgage, tuition, or bills again. You live in my penthouse. Your daughter will have the best tutors, the best security. Lucas's heart hammered against his ribs. $2 million. The number was unfathomable. It wasn't just Lily's cochlear implants. It was the best specialists in the world. It was a college fund. It was the end of the suffocating, grinding anxiety that kept him awake every single night, terrified he would fail his little girl. He looked at Catherine. She was beautiful. Yes, but beneath the glamour, he saw a woman fighting for her life's work. She was cornered, much like he was, just in a different tax bracket. "Why me?" Lucas asked, his voice rough. "You could hire a private military contractor. You could hire a male model." "A model would fold the second Roland threatened him," Catherine replied. "A mercenary would look like a transaction to the board. But you're a blue-collar father. A widow, I assume." Lucas tensed. "Yes. It's the perfect narrative," she said, her voice softening slightly. "The billionaire heiress who fell in love with a grounded, honorable family man. It grounds me. It makes me look stable to the shareholders. And most importantly, Roland Caldwell won't know how to handle you. You're entirely outside his ecosystem." Lucas stared through the windshield at the blurry neon lights of the city. He thought of his late wife, Sarah. He remembered holding her hand in the hospice ward, promising her that he would do whatever it took to give Lily a beautiful life. Whatever it took. He slowly turned his head back to Catherine Whitmore. "I don't want $2 million, Lucas said. Catherine's face fell. "3. I can do $3 million, but I want a comprehensive medical trust set up for my daughter, managed by an independent third party." Lucas interrupted. "I want full autonomy over my parenting. You don't discipline her. You don't use her as a prop for the paparazzi. And if Roland Caldwell ever comes within 50 feet of my little girl, the deal is off, and I walk away with everything." Catherine exhaled a long, shaky breath, a spark of immense relief in her eyes. She held out her hand, her manicured fingers trembling just slightly. "You have a deal, Mr. Miller." Lucas reached out, his rough, scarred hand engulfing hers. "Call me Lucas. We're engaged, after all." The next 24 hours were a blur of blinding speed and terrifying efficiency. Lucas barely had time to process what he had done. True to her word, Catherine had a small army of fixers, lawyers, and stylists descend upon them. Lucas explained the situation to Lily in the simplest terms he could manage. He had met a very nice woman who needed their help, and they were going to live in a very big house for a little while. Lily, a sweet, observant child with her mother's bright green eyes, had simply nodded, adjusting her outdated hearing aids. "Does she have a dog?" Lily had asked. When Lucas relayed the question to Catherine, a purebred golden retriever puppy was delivered to their new penthouse 3 hours later. The wedding took place in the sterile, fluorescent-lit office of a private judge, a man who charged an astronomical fee for discretion. Lucas wore a bespoke Tom Ford suit that Catherine's team had tailored overnight. He felt like an imposter. Beside him, Catherine wore an elegant, understated white-tailored suit. She looked breathtaking, but Lucas could see the tension in her jaw. "Do you, Lucas Thomas Miller, take Catherine Whitmore to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the judge droned. Lucas looked at Catherine. She met his gaze, her eyes silently pleading with him not to back out. "I do," Lucas said. 10 minutes later, the ink was dry. The medical trust for Lily was fully funded. Lucas Miller, a blue-collar landscaper from Queens, was legally married to one of the richest women in North America. The real test, however, came that evening. To solidify the marriage and head off Roland Caldwell's takeover, Catherine had to make a public debut with Lucas. The venue was the annual Horizon Charity Gala, a room packed with the city's elite, board members of Whitmore Holdings, and, inevitably, Roland himself. "Just stay close to me," Catherine murmured as they stepped out of the bulletproof Maybach. Cameras flashed like lightning, blinding Lucas. He instinctively placed a protective hand on the small of Catherine's back, a gesture that caused the paparazzi to scream for more photos. "I'm not going anywhere," Lucas replied, keeping his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the crowd. They navigated the ballroom, a glittering sea of diamonds and champagne. Catherine introduced him to various board members. Lucas played his part perfectly. He was charming, humble, and fiercely devoted, looking at Catherine with a manufactured adoration that seemed to thoroughly confuse the skeptical executives. "He's remarkably unpolished." Catherine. Thomas, an elderly, cynical board member, remarked, sipping his scotch. "Not your usual type." "Nah, that's exactly why I love him." "Thomas," Catherine replied smoothly, linking her arm through Lucas's. "Lucas is real, something this world severely lacks." Lucas excused himself an hour later to use the restroom, the forced smiling making his jaw ache. He pushed through the heavy mahogany doors of the men's room and walked over to the marble sinks, splashing cold water on his face. He stared at his reflection, tugging at the silk tie. "It's a good suit. Covers up the dirt under your fingernails almost perfectly." Lucas froze. He looked up into the mirror. Standing behind him, leaning casually against the bathroom stalls, was a man in his late 40s. He had silver hair slicked back with precision, a sharp, aristocratic jawline, and eyes as cold and calculating as a serpent's. Roland Caldwell. Lucas turned around slowly, grabbing a hand towel. He dried his hands, his muscles coiling like springs. "Mr. Caldwell, I assume." "And you must be the miracle worker," Roland sneered, taking a slow step forward. "The knight in shining armor who swept my dear Catherine off her feet in a matter of days. Tell me, Mr. Miller, how much did she pay you?" "5 million? 10? "I don't know what you're talking about," Lucas said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I love my wife," Roland laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Your wife? Oh, that is rich." He stepped closer, invading Lucas's space. But Lucas didn't retreat an inch. "You think you're smart, Miller. You think you've hit the jackpot. You're playing bodyguard for a damsel in distress. Stay away from her." "Roland, I won't warn you twice," Lucas said, dropping the towel. Roland's smirk faded, replaced by a look of genuine, chilling amusement. "You really don't know, do you?" "Know what? You think Catherine is the victim in this little corporate melodrama?" Roland tilted his head, studying Lucas like a bug under a microscope. "You think I'm the big bad wolf trying to steal her company. I know you sent 2 goons to grab her at the Waldorf." "I sent 2 men to serve her with a subpoena," Roland corrected, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "A subpoena regarding the embezzlement of $40 million from the Employee Pension Fund. Money that disappeared 3 months before her father conveniently had his fatal heart attack." Lucas stared at him, keeping his expression neutral, but his heart skipped a beat. Catherine isn't hiding from me because I want to marry her. Mr. Miller, Roland said, stepping back and straightening his cuffs. She's hiding from me because I'm the only one on the board who knows she's a sociopath who destroyed her own father to take the throne. And this marriage, it's just her way of securing the absolute voting right so she can bury the evidence forever. Roland walked toward the door, pausing with his hand on the brass handle. He looked back at Lucas, his eyes glinting with malice. By the way, did she mention her first fiancé, the one she was engaged to 3 years ago? Lucas said nothing. His name was Julian, Roland said softly. He figured out what she was doing. He threatened to go to the SEC. 3 days later, his brakes failed on the Pacific Coast Highway. Tragic accident. Roland smiled. Sleep with one eye open, Lucas. She pays well, but the severance package is a killer. The heavy door swung shut, leaving Lucas alone in the deafening silence of the marble bathroom. The cold water on his face suddenly felt like ice. He looked at his left hand, at the heavy gold wedding band resting on his ring finger. He had done this to protect his daughter. He had done this to save Lily. But as the echoes of Roland Caldwell's words settled into his bones, Lucas realized with a sickening twist of dread that he might have just brought the monster directly into his home. The ride back to the penthouse was suffocatingly quiet. The Maybach's tires hissed against the wet New York pavement, and the tinted windows turned the city lights into blurred streaks of neon. Catherine sat on the opposite side of the leather bench, her eyes closed, exhaustion pulling at the corners of her mouth. She looked fragile, beautiful, and utterly exhausted. Lucas stared at her, Roland Caldwell's venomous words echoing in his skull. She's a sociopath who destroyed her own father. Tragic accident. Sleep with one eye open. When they arrived at the Whitmore penthouse, a sprawling, 2-story glass marvel overlooking Central Park, Lucas went straight to Lily's temporary room. He gently pushed open the heavy oak door. Lily was fast asleep in a bed that looked large enough to swallow her whole. Her new golden retriever puppy curled protectively at her feet. She was safe, for now. Lucas closed the door and walked back out to the main living area. Catherine was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a crystal glass of amber liquid in her hand. She had kicked off her heels, looking smaller without them. "You were quiet in the car," Catherine said softly, not turning around. "Did Roland say something to you at the gala?" Lucas stopped a few feet away, his broad shoulders tense. He wasn't a man built for corporate espionage. He was a man who built things with his hands, a man who believed in a firm handshake and looking someone in the eye. "Roland had a lot to say," Lucas replied, his voice a low, steady rumble in the cavernous room. "He mentioned a subpoena. He mentioned $40 million missing from a pension fund, and he mentioned a dead fiancé." Catherine's shoulders went entirely rigid. The glass in her hand trembled, the ice clinking loudly in the silent room. She didn't turn around for a long time. "And you believed him?" she whispered. "I don't know what to believe." "Catherine," Lucas said, stepping closer. "I took this deal to protect my daughter. I didn't take it to become an accessory to embezzlement or a target for a corporate hit squad." Catherine finally turned. Her hazel eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her jaw was set with a fierce, aristocratic pride. "Roland Caldwell is a predator, Lucas. He isolates his prey. He finds the one crack in your armor and drives a wedge into it. He wants you to doubt me, because if you leave before my birthday on Friday, he wins." "Then tell me the truth," Lucas demanded. "Right now. If we are going to play this game, I need to know exactly what kind of board we're playing on." Catherine took a shaky breath and gestured to one of the velvet armchairs. "Sit down, Lucas. It's a long story. Lucas shook his head. I'll stand. She nodded, accepting his distance. The $40 million is missing. That part is true, but I didn't take it. She looked down at her glass. My father did. Lucas frowned. Your father? The billionaire who built all of this. Billionaires are rarely satisfied with what they have, Catherine said bitterly. He made a series of disastrous bets in overseas real estate. To cover the margin calls and hide his failure from the board, he quietly siphoned money from the employee pension fund. He thought he could replace it before anyone noticed. But the market crashed, and the money was gone. And Roland Caldwell? Roland was his right hand. He helped him move the money, Catherine explained, her voice gaining strength. When my father realized he couldn't fix it, the guilt began to eat him alive. He drafted a full confession, planning to turn himself and Roland over to the SEC. 3 days later, my father had a massive, fatal heart attack. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. You think Roland killed him? I know he did, Catherine said, her eyes flashing with cold fury. My father's private physician was on Roland's payroll. The autopsy was rushed. The confession vanished. And the fiancé? Lucas pressed, refusing to let her off the hook. Catherine closed her eyes, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. He found out about the missing money. He confronted Roland without telling me. Roland saw him as a loose end. She looked at Lucas. Her expression shattered. I didn't kill him, Lucas. I loved him, and Roland took him from me. Just like he took my father. Lucas stared at her, searching for the lie. He had spent years reading contractors, clients, and suppliers. He knew when someone was trying to sell him a faulty bill of goods. The grief in Catherine's eyes was raw, ugly, and entirely real. Roland wants the absolute voting rights on Friday. Catherine continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. Once he has them, he can permanently bury the pension fund audit. He can erase the trail. But if I get those rights, I have a team of forensic accountants ready to freeze the servers. I can hand Roland to the FBI on a silver platter. That is why he is so desperate to stop us. Lucas let out a long, heavy exhale, rubbing the back of his neck. The sheer scale of the deception was dizzying. I need you, Lucas, Catherine pleaded, stepping toward him. I know I bought your time. I know I bought your name. But right now, you are the only person in this city who isn't trying to destroy me. Lucas looked at the hallway leading to Lily's room. He had made a promise to protect his daughter. Running away now would mean breaking his contract, losing the medical trust, and leaving Catherine to be devoured by a murderer. Okay, Lucas said quietly. But we do this my way. No more secrets, no more blind spots. If Roland comes for us, I'm not playing the polite society husband. Catherine gave a weak, relieved nod. Whatever you need. By Wednesday morning, the tension in the penthouse was thick enough to cut with a drywall saw. Lucas had spent the last 48 hours transforming from a prop husband into a wartime consigliere. He had called in a favor from his old friend, Detective Bobby Ford, a grizzled NYPD veteran who owed Lucas for landscaping his mother's backyard for free. Under the guise of a background check, Lucas had Bobby dig into Roland Caldwell's offshore holdings and the police report from the previous fiancé's car crash. At 10:00 a.m., Bobby met Lucas in a nondescript diner in Hell's Kitchen. You stepped in at this time. Davy, Bobby said, sliding a manila folder across the sticky Formica table. He took a bite of a greasy diner sausage. Your new wife's rival! He's a ghost! but he's a ghost with very deep, very dirty pockets. Lucas opened the folder. Inside were crime scene photos, financial transcripts, and an encrypted flash drive. What am I looking at? Bobby. The crash report from 3 years ago, Bobby said, his tone turning deadly serious. The local PD ruled it a mechanical failure. But I pulled the original mechanic's notes. The brake line wasn't worn down. It was scored. Cut with a diamond-edge wire. Someone murdered that kid, Lucas, and Caldwell's shell company bought the mechanic a nice new condo in Boca Raton 2 months later. Lucas's jaw tightened. Catherine was telling the truth. Yeah, she was. Bobby agreed. And she's in the crosshairs. But here is the real kicker. Bobby tapped the black flash drive resting on top of the photos. That is a copy of Caldwell's digital footprint for the last week. He's liquidating assets. Fast. He's moving money to non-extradition countries. Lucas frowned. Why? If he thinks he's going to win the voting rights on Friday. Why run? Because he knows he's losing control of the narrative, Bobby said, leaning in. You spooked him, Lucas. You weren't part of the plan. And now, Caldwell is preparing an exit strategy. But a guy like him, he doesn't leave loose ends. If he's going to run, he's going to burn the house down on his way out. He's going to silence Catherine permanently before she can freeze those servers. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in Lucas's chest. Lily, exactly, Bobby said. Caldwell can't get to Catherine in that fortress of a penthouse, but he knows your daughter is the leverage. Where is the kid right now? Lucas looked at his watch. 10:45 a.m. Catherine's security detail took her to the new private academy on the Upper East Side. She's at a music therapy session. Get her, Bobby ordered, throwing a $20 bill on the table. Now. Lucas didn't hesitate. He sprinted out of the diner, dodging yellow cabs and pedestrians, his heart hammering against his ribs. He yanked his phone from his pocket, dialing the head of Catherine's security, a stoic ex-Marine named Miller, ironically. But the call went straight to voicemail. He dialed Catherine next. She picked up on the first ring. Lucas, is everything all right? Where is Lily? Lucas demanded, his voice a frantic bark as he flagged down a taxi. She's at the academy. My detail is with her. Why? What's going on? Roland is making a move, Lucas said, sliding into the cab and shouting the school's address to the driver. Call your men. Tell them to lock down the room. Nobody goes in or out until I get there. Do you understand? I'm calling them right now, Catherine said, her voice dropping into her authoritative CEO register. 10 agonizing minutes later, the cab skidded to a halt outside the prestigious academy. Lucas threw a 50 at the driver and bolted out of the car. The school was a sprawling Gothic building, surrounded by wrought iron fences. Lucas bypassed the front desk, ignoring the protests of the receptionist, and took the marble stairs 2 at a time. He burst through the double doors of the music wing. Down the hallway, outside the therapy room, 2 of Catherine's security guards were on the ground. One was unconscious, a dark bruise blooming on his temple. The other was groaning, clutching a tased side. Standing in the doorway of the therapy room were the 2 men in dark suits from the Waldorf Astoria. The brute with the broken nose had his hand on the doorknob. Lucas saw red. Hey! Lucas roared, a primal, guttural sound that echoed down the quiet school hallway. The 2 fixers turned. For a fraction of a second, surprise registered on their faces. They clearly hadn't expected the blue-collar husband to be a threat. That hesitation was all Lucas needed. He hit the first man, the taller one with the broken nose, like a freight train. Lucas had spent 20 years hauling stone, swinging sledgehammers and wrestling oak roots out of frozen ground. He didn't know martial arts, but he knew leverage, and he had the sheer raw power of a father fighting for his child. He slammed his shoulder into the man's chest, driving him backward into the plaster wall with a sickening crunch. The man gasped, dropping his heavy flashlight. Before he could recover, Lucas delivered a devastating right hook to his jaw, snapping the man's head back. He crumpled to the floor, out cold. The second man, a leaner, faster operative, pulled a sleek, suppressed pistol from his jacket. "Back off! Miller!" the man hissed, raising the weapon. Lucas didn't stop moving. He grabbed a heavy bronze bust of Beethoven from a display pedestal nearby and hurled it with terrifying speed. It caught the operative squarely in the chest. As the man staggered back, the gun discharging a quiet thud into the ceiling. Lucas closed the distance. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it violently until the gun clattered to the floor, then drove his knee upward into the man's ribs. The second fixer collapsed, wheezing on the polished hardwood. Lucas stood over them, chest heaving, his knuckles bruised and bleeding. He kicked the pistol down the hallway, out of reach. He turned to the door, his heart in his throat. "Lily!" The door opened a crack. A terrified, tear-streaked face peered out. "Daddy!" Lucas dropped to his knees. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." Lily threw the door open and launched herself into his arms, her golden retriever puppy barking frantically behind her. Lucas wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his face in her hair, shaking with adrenaline and relief. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" he asked, pulling back to inspect her. "No," Lily whimpered, pointing to her hearing aid. "They turned off the lights and it got really loud. The nice security men told me to hide under the piano." "You did so good, sweetie. You did so good." Lucas breathed, kissing her forehead. Footsteps pounded down the hallway. Lucas spun around, instantly shielding Lily with his body, ready to fight again. But it wasn't Roland's men. It was Catherine, flanked by 4 more heavily armed security personnel. She had clearly raced from the corporate office. Her hair was flying wildly, and she had abandoned her heels somewhere along the way. She stopped dead in her tracks, taking in the scene. The 2 unconscious fixers, her downed guards, and Lucas, kneeling on the floor, clutching Lily as if the world were ending. Catherine rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside Lucas. She didn't look at the unconscious men. She only looked at Lily. "Are you hurt?" Catherine asked, her voice trembling with a raw, maternal panic Lucas hadn't expected from her. "I'm okay, Catherine." Lily sniffled. Catherine reached out, her manicured hand hovering for a moment before she gently smoothed Lily's hair back. "I am so sorry, Lily. I am so sorry." She looked up at Lucas, her hazel eyes blazing with a dangerous, lethal light. "I didn't think he would cross this line. I thought there were rules." "There are no rules," Lucas said, his voice cold and hard as steel as he stood up, lifting Lily into his arms. "He tried to take my daughter. The contract is done. Catherine, the defensive play is over." Catherine stood up slowly, her gaze lingering on the bruised face of Roland's enforcer. The vulnerability she had shown a moment ago vanished, replaced entirely by the ruthless, calculating CEO of Whitmore Holdings. "You're right," Catherine said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "He wanted a war. We're going to give him an execution." She turned to the captain of her security detail. "Call the police. Have these 2 pieces of garbage arrested for attempted kidnapping. And call my legal team." "What are we doing?" Lucas asked, tightening his grip on Lily. "We are moving the timeline," Catherine said, pulling her phone from her pocket. "My birthday is at midnight tomorrow, but we aren't waiting for the board meeting. We are going to Roland's private gala tonight. We are going to walk in there as husband and wife, and we are going to destroy him in front of every single person he respects." Lucas looked at the woman standing in front of him. She wasn't a damsel in distress begging for help in a hotel lobby anymore. She was a queen preparing to slaughter her rivals, and for the first time since he met her. Lucas didn't just feel pity for Catherine Whitmore. He felt a deep, profound respect. "All right," Lucas said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the unconscious men on the floor. "Let's go ruin a billionaire." The Whitmore penthouse was transformed from a luxurious sanctuary into a tactical war room within the hour. Lucas paced the length of the marble floor, his knuckles wrapped in white athletic tape, the stark white contrasting sharply with the deep purple bruising across his skin. In the adjacent room, Bobby Ford sat heavily in a velvet armchair, a pump-action shotgun resting casually across his lap. Bobby had pulled every favor he had in the NYPD, arranging for 2 off-duty SWAT officers to stand guard at the penthouse elevators. Lily was safely tucked away in the primary suite, watching cartoons with her golden retriever, completely insulated from the storm brewing outside her door. "Oh, she doesn't leave your sight, Bobby," Lucas said, leaning in the doorway. "If the building catches fire, you carry her out. If someone you don't know walks through those doors, you shoot first. Nobody is getting past this door." "Davy," Bobby replied, his eyes hard and serious. "You focus on the snake. We've got the nest secured." Lucas nodded, taking a deep breath before turning back to the main living area. Catherine was seated at the massive oak dining table, surrounded by 3 lawyers and the head of her forensic accounting team, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Jenkins. "The gala is at the Caldwell Foundation's private estate in the Hamptons," Catherine was saying, her finger tracing a map on an iPad. "Roland's primary servers, the ones not connected to the cloud, the ones holding the original ledgers and the offshore routing numbers, are in the basement of that estate. It's an air-gapped system. We can't hack it from here." "So, how do we get the data?" Lucas asked, stepping up to the table. Catherine looked up at him, her hazel eyes completely devoid of fear. The terrified woman from the Waldorf was dead and buried. In her place sat the undisputed monarch of Whitmore Holdings. "We don't," Catherine said. "We just need to plug a transponder into the server for 60 seconds. Sarah's team will do the rest remotely once the bridge is established. But Roland's security is paramilitary. The server room requires biometric access, his thumbprint." "How are you going to get his thumbprint?" one of the lawyers asked, sweating profusely. Catherine stood up, walking slowly toward Lucas. "Roland is a narcissist. He believes he is untouchable. When we walk into that gala, he is going to assume one of 2 things. Either his men haven't reported in yet and we are blissfully unaware of the hit on Lily, or we know, and we are coming to surrender to save her." She stopped in front of Lucas, reaching up to adjust the lapels of his hastily procured midnight black tuxedo. Her fingers brushed against his chest, sending an unexpected jolt of electricity through him. "He will want to gloat," Catherine murmured, looking directly into Lucas's eyes. "He will pull me into his private study to demand my resignation in exchange for Lily's safety, and when he does, I'll be right behind you." Lucas finished, his voice a low, dangerous gravel. "Exactly," Catherine said. "You take him down. We force his hand onto the scanner, plug in the transponder, and wait for Sarah to download the kill shot." Lucas looked down at her. "It's a huge risk, Catherine. If his security catches us in that room, You go to prison for corporate espionage, or worse. We don't walk out of that estate. My father built this company from nothing, Catherine whispered, her voice tight with emotion. He made a terrible mistake, and Roland used it to bleed him dry and murder the man I loved. I am not running anymore. Lucas, will you stand with me? Lucas looked at the fierce, beautiful woman standing before him. He thought of the $2 million, the medical trust, the contract. None of it mattered anymore. This wasn't a job. This was a reckoning. Lead the way, Mrs. Miller, Lucas said. 2 hours later, a sleek, armored SUV pulled up to the sweeping iron gates of the Caldwell estate. The property was a fortress, masquerading as a summer home, with perfectly manicured hedges that Lucas noted critically, and armed guards disguised as valets. The security guard at the gate approached the vehicle with a clipboard. He tapped on the tinted glass. Lucas rolled the window down slowly. Invitation, please. The guard grunted. We aren't on the list, Catherine said smoothly from the back seat, leaning forward so the interior lights caught her face. She was wearing a blood-red evening gown that commanded absolute attention. But I highly recommend you radio Mr. Caldwell and tell him Catherine Whitmore and her husband are here to see him. Tell him we are ready to negotiate. The guard's eyes widened. He stepped back, speaking rapidly into his earpiece. A moment later, the heavy iron gates swung open. Welcome to the Lion's Den, Lucas muttered, putting the SUV in gear and driving up the crushed gravel driveway. As they stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the grand entrance, the heavy oak doors swung open, spilling golden light and the sound of a string quartet onto the lawn. The moment they crossed the threshold into the grand ballroom, the music didn't stop, but the conversation certainly did. Hundreds of the city's wealthiest elites, board members, and politicians turned to stare. Catherine walked with the posture of royalty, her arm looped firmly through Lucas's. Lucas matched her stride, his broad shoulders squared, his eyes scanning the room like a hawk looking for a threat. He didn't look like a blue-collar prop. He looked like a highly trained bodyguard, radiating a quiet, lethal violence that made the wealthy guests instinctively step back to clear a path. At the far end of the ballroom, standing by a towering champagne pyramid, was Roland Caldwell. He was holding a crystal flute, smiling a thin reptilian smile. But as his eyes locked onto Catherine, and then drifted to the terrifyingly calm face of Lucas Miller, the smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. But Lucas saw it. Roland knew his men had failed. Right on cue, Catherine whispered softly to Lucas. Here he comes. Roland handed his glass to a passing waiter and strode across the floor, flanked by 2 massive security guards who looked identical to the ones Lucas had left unconscious on the school floor. Catherine, Roland said, his voice dripping with faux warmth as he reached them. What an unexpected surprise. And Mr. Miller, I see you're still wearing the suit. It fits better than I thought, Lucas replied, not extending his hand. Roland's eyes hardened. I imagine you're here to discuss the future of Whitmore Holdings. The board is quite anxious. I'm here to end this. Roland, Catherine said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the closest guests. Privately, just the 3 of us. Roland stared at her, calculating the angles. He gestured toward a set of heavy mahogany doors guarded by another man. My private study. Let's finally put this ugly business behind us. Shall we? The private study was a masterclass in aggressive wealth. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls. A massive antique globe sat in the corner, and a heavy mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. Behind the desk was a reinforced steel door leading to the basement servers. The moment the heavy study doors clicked shut behind them, the polite facade vanished. Roland walked around his desk, dropping the aristocratic charm entirely. He leaned heavily on the polished wood, glaring at Catherine. "Where are my men? Miller!" Roland demanded, his voice a vicious hiss. "Sleeping it off in a holding cell," Lucas said calmly, stepping fully into the room and rolling his shoulders. "Attempted kidnapping of a minor carries a heavy sentence." They were very eager to point fingers to secure a plea deal, Roland scoffed, though a bead of sweat appeared at his hairline. "You have nothing tying them to me. They're independent contractors. You're bluffing, Catherine. You walked in here because you know I hold all the cards. Sign the proxy papers transferring your voting rights to me, and I'll let you and your muscle walk out of here alive." "I'm not signing anything." "Roland," Catherine said, walking toward him. "I know about the 40 million. I know you framed my father. And I know about Julian's brake lines." Roland burst into a sharp, cruel laugh. "Knowing and proving are two entirely different things, my dear. You have zero evidence. The only proof of my financial ingenuity is sitting on an air-gapped server behind a biometric lock that you cannot break. By midnight tomorrow, the board will vote you out. I will liquidate the company, and any trace of your father's pension fund disaster will be erased. You lose." "I don't think so," Lucas said. Roland looked at Lucas with utter disdain. "And what are you going to do? Landscaper? Punch me? Go ahead. Assaulting a billionaire in his own home will get you 20 years in federal lockup. Who's going to raise your deaf little girl then?" The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lucas moved with a speed that defied his massive frame. He cleared the space between the door and the desk in 3 long strides. Roland barely had time to flinch before Lucas's hand shot out, grabbing him by the throat of his tailored tuxedo shirt. With a raw grunt of effort, Lucas hoisted Roland clean off the ground and slammed him backward onto the mahogany desk. The expensive crystal decanter shattered, spilling amber scotch everywhere. You don't ever," Lucas snarled, his face inches from Roland's terrified eyes. "Speak about my daughter again." Roland gasped, clawing at Lucas's immovable grip. "Guards!" he choked out. "They can't hear you." Catherine, coldly, stepping around the desk. "This room is soundproofed. You made sure of that so you could conduct your illegal business in peace." Lucas dragged the gasping billionaire off the desk and hauled him toward the steel door, leading to the server room. He slammed Roland against the biometric scanner. "Thumb!" Lucas commanded. "Go to hell!" Roland spat, blood trickling from a cut on his cheek. Lucas didn't argue. He grabbed Roland's right hand, twisted the wrist until the billionaire let out a high-pitched scream of agony, and forcefully pressed his thumb against the glowing green glass of the scanner. The machine chirped. The heavy steel door unlatched with a heavy mechanical thunk. "Hold him!" Catherine ordered. Lucas shoved Roland to the floor, placing a heavy boot squarely on the man's chest, pinning him to the Persian rug. Catherine pushed open the door and practically flew down the metal stairs into the glowing, humming server room. Roland wheezed under Lucas's boot. "You're dead. Miller, you're both dead." "Shut up," Lucas said, pressing slightly harder. He pulled out his earpiece. "Bobby, talk to me." "We're good here. Davy," Bobby's voice crackled. "SWAT is drinking coffee. Kid is asleep. How's the raid?" "In progress," Lucas replied. Down in the server room, Catherine pulled a small black transponder from her clutch. She located the primary server bank, yanked off a protective panel, and jammed the device into the master USB port. She tapped her earpiece. "Sarah, you're live. Receiving the handshake now. Ms. Whitmore." Sarah's voice echoed in her ear. "Bypassing internal firewalls." Oh, wow. He didn't even try to hide the ledgers on the local drive. "I have the pension fund transfers. I have the shell companies." "Do you have the wire transfers to the mechanic in Boca Raton?" Catherine demanded, her heart pounding against her ribs. Searching. Yes. Got it. $300,000 wired from Caldwell's offshore account to a Vince Marino 2 days after the crash. Catherine squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear of relief and grief falling down her cheek. "Send it all to the SEC, the FBI, and the district attorney's office. Now." "Sending. The data is officially out of his hands. Catherine, you got him." Catherine pulled the transponder out, her hands shaking, and walked back up the stairs. She looked down at Roland, who was glaring up at her with pure, unadulterated hatred. "It's over. Roland," Catherine said, her voice echoing with a profound, earth-shattering finality. "The FBI has the ledgers. They have the wire transfers for Julian's murder. They have everything." Roland's face went pale, the color draining from his cheeks as the reality of his total defeat set in. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors of the study burst open. Roland's security team flooded the room, weapons drawn, pointing directly at Lucas. "Let him go! Hands in the air!" the captain shouted. Lucas didn't move his boot, but he slowly raised his hands. Before the tension could snap into violence, a new voice boomed from the hallway. "Federal agents, drop your weapons!" A dozen men and women in FBI windbreakers swarmed into the study, their weapons trained on Roland's security team. The guards, realizing the game was up and unwilling to die for a doomed employer, slowly lowered their guns and kicked them away. An FBI special agent in charge stepped forward, looking at the scene. He looked at Roland, pinned under Lucas's boot. "Roland Caldwell?" the agent asked. "Get this animal off me!" Roland screamed. "Step back, sir!" the agent said to Lucas. Lucas lifted his boot and took a slow step backward, standing firmly beside Catherine. The agents hauled Roland to his feet, slamming him against the bookshelves to cuff him. "Roland Caldwell, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent." As the agents dragged the screaming, thrashing billionaire out of the study and into the crowded ballroom, ensuring his public destruction in front of the entire elite class of the city, Catherine stood frozen. She had won. The nightmare was over. Lucas looked at her, seeing the adrenaline begin to crash. He reached out, gently wrapping his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, burying her face against his chest, right there in the ruined study. And finally, let herself cry. Friday, 11:59 p.m. The Whitmore penthouse was quiet, bathed in the soft amber glow of the city lights pouring in through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The torrential rain from the beginning of the week had cleared, leaving behind a crisp, starry night over Central Park. Lucas stood by the glass, holding a glass of sparkling water, looking out at the sprawling metropolis. He wore a simple pair of jeans and a gray t-shirt. The bespoke suits were packed away in their garment bags. In the primary suite, Lily was fast asleep. Her cochlear implant surgery had been officially scheduled for the following Tuesday with the top pediatric surgeon in the country. The medical trust was locked, legally binding, and completely untouched by the fallout of Roland Caldwell's arrest. The sound of soft footsteps on the hardwood floor pulled Lucas from his thoughts. Catherine emerged from the hallway. She was wearing a simple silk robe, her hair damp from a shower, completely devoid of makeup. She looked younger, lighter, as if a physical weight had been excised from her soul. "You're awake," Catherine said softly, walking over to stand beside him. "Just watching the clock," Lucas replied. Catherine looked at her phone resting on the side table. The digital numbers flipped. 12 Mao a.m. "Happy birthday, Catherine," Lucas said quietly. Catherine let out a long, shaky exhale. 35. The voting rights just defaulted into my name. The board convened an emergency session an hour ago via conference call, with Roland in federal custody and the truth out about my father. They unanimously ratified my absolute control of Whitmore Holdings. "You did it," Lucas said, turning to look at her. "You saved your father's legacy." "We did it," Catherine corrected, her hazel eyes meeting his. "I would be dead right now if you hadn't caught me in that hotel lobby." "Lucas, I owe you my life." Lucas shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. We had a contract. I did my job. You paid me. And you saved my daughter's hearing. We're square." He set his glass down on the table and rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly feeling incredibly awkward. The adrenaline of the last few days had masked a profound, terrifying realization. He had grown entirely too attached to this woman. I'll start packing up my and Lily's things in the morning," Lucas said, his voice a little thicker than he intended. "I know the contract says we have to stay married for a year for optics, but we can do that from a distance. You can have your penthouse back. I'll get an apartment in Brooklyn. Keep my head down. We can have our lawyers draw up the divorce papers in 12 months. Catherine stared at him, her expression unreadable. She stepped closer, invading his personal space, bringing with her the faint, intoxicating scent of vanilla and expensive shampoo. "Is that what you want?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Lucas looked down at her. He saw the fierce, brilliant CEO who took down a titan, but he also saw the woman who had dropped to her knees on a school floor to comfort a terrified little girl. "No," Lucas admitted, his voice rough. "It's not what I want. I don't belong in this world. Catherine, I don't care about the money or the galas, but—" "But?" she prompted, her eyes searching his. "But I don't want to leave you," Lucas finished, the honesty hanging between them like a fragile glass ornament. Catherine smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. She reached into the pocket of her silk robe and pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment paper. Lucas recognized the legal seal. It was their marriage contract and the prenuptial agreement. Without breaking eye contact, Catherine gripped the top of the document and slowly, deliberately, tore it in half. Then she tore it again, letting the pieces flutter to the pristine floor. "The board doesn't need optics anymore. I have absolute control," Catherine said softly. "The contract is void. There is no fake marriage. There are no obligations. There is no payday." Lucas's heart hammered against his ribs. "So, what is there?" Catherine reached up, resting her hand against Lucas's cheek, her thumb lightly tracing the fading bruise on his jaw from the fight at the school. "There's a man who risked everything to protect a woman he didn't even know," Catherine whispered. "There's a little girl who I want to see grow up and hear the world. And there's a woman who is incredibly tired of pretending." Lucas looked into her eyes, seeing the vulnerability she was offering him. He reached up, covering her hand with his own. He leaned down, closing the distance between them, and kissed her. It wasn't for the paparazzi. It wasn't for the board. It was real, grounded, and entirely theirs. When they finally pulled apart, Catherine rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring thrum of his heartbeat. The fake marriage that had started as a desperate plea in a crowded lobby had become the most real thing either of them had ever known. They had built a foundation out of chaos, and for the first time in years, Lucas Miller knew exactly what he was going to build next. A life. What a breathtaking conclusion. From a desperate plea in a hotel lobby to a high-stakes takedown of a corrupt billionaire. Lucas and Catherine proved that sometimes the most authentic love stories begin with a lie. They faced an unimaginable danger to protect what mattered most, and in the end, they found each other. If this intense, dramatic journey kept you on the edge of your seat, please smash that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life drama. What was your favorite twist in the story? Let us know in the comments below.